Welcome everyone. I am Suchismita Das. I'm a fellow at the Center of Inter-Asian Research and an assistant professor here at Ahmedabad University. So we started this webinar in December 2023, Perceptions of Risk in the Himalayas, and so far we have managed to generate a robust conversation across disciplines on how risk is central to the ways in which Himalayas are framed historically, geologically, culturally. So while using the concept of risk as a lens to understand the region, we are also critically interrogating the term itself and its efficacy and hoping to generate some new insights about the region and about the term along the way. So continuing on this fruitful line of interrogation, we have with us today Dr. Sayantani Mukherjee, Assistant Professor of History at Ashoka University. She is a historian of modern China and the Trans-Himalayan Tibetan border worlds of 19th and 20th century Asia. She received her PhD in history from Columbia University in 2021. She specializes in the history of science and statecraft with broader research and teaching interests in social and economic history, labor theory, imperial and transnational history, and India-China history. She is currently working on her first book manuscript, tentatively titled Between Two Worlds, British India, Qing China, and the Technologies of Empire Making in Tibet in the 19th century. Drawing on archival research in multiple languages and sites across India, England, Taiwan, and China, including Tibet, her project foregrounds the coercive socio-technological discourses employed by British India and Qing China in exploring, identifying, and spatially constituting Tibet. So today our talk is titled Risky Business, a critical rethinking of land, imperial capital, and British failures in the Trans-Himalayas. It will offer a critical inquiry of the history of imperial failures in the Trans-Himalayas through the lens of the tea trade there. Dr. Mukherjee analyzes the emergence of imperial border making as a form of risk management through chronicling the British Indian state's attempts and eventual failure to break the Chinese monopoly on tea trading in Tibet. This was happening at the very time that Britain replaced Queen China as the largest exporter of tea on the global stage. She will analyze specifically the trade marks established in Tibet and the Eastern Himalayas between the late 19th century and early 20th century as economic but also geopolitical nodes. While the story of tea usually is told as one of industrial modernization that reshaped global imperial hierarchies, this talk will show us how militarized frontier making advanced market capitalism throughout the Trans-Himalayan region. Dr. Mukherjee argues that exigencies of war propaganda and imperial frontier making shaped not only the spatial and cultural frames of tea consumption in Tibet, but also the territorial entities of the Himalayas as borderlands and indeed Tibet itself. So we are looking forward to a very exciting talk and especially continuing in this question of trading and risk, which we began to touch upon a little with Aditi Saraf's talk as well. Before I turn it over to Shantani, I'll ask Tejaswini maybe to say a few words about the center.
Thank you, Suchismita. Such a pleasure to have you with us, Sayantani Mukherjee. I'm sorry it's like in the heat of May that you're present and on a voting day in Gujarat, but I still think there's a respectable audience. I'm from the Center for Inter-Asian Research, and the Perceptions of Risk in the Himalayas is one of the many webinars that we run. I would like to draw the audience's attention also to the long-running Indian Ocean webinar series, which is now in its second iteration, and also a newer one called South Asia and the South China Sea. I think there are many overlaps with today's talk as well. It's difficult to know where exactly to place a scholar or a piece of work, but it's really nice to think that there are crisscrossing connections that we can also make if we listen to all of these webinar series. This is encouragement to all of you not to hyper-specialize, but to attend all our talks. Welcome again.
Thank you, Tejaswini, and thank you, Suchismita, for that introduction, and of course, for the invitation to be a part of this series. And I wanted to thank Satvik before we start for making sure you got all the logistics together and keeping me on schedule. So quickly, before we start, as Suchismita said, I work on some things very specific for my dissertation book project. And that's very much about mapping, cartography, the creation of new geographical ecosystems, about sort of parts of the Trans-Himalayas that were produced as sort of imperial peripheries by both British India and Qing China. But technically, that is not the work that I will be presenting today, because I've been attending a few of the seminars that you have had as part of the risk team. And I wanted instead to focus on how risk, but more particularly the idea of failure in particular, and how that comes to be framed with respect to sort of imperial, colonial, or even post-colonial ventures into the Himalayas and the Trans-Himalayas. So I'm just going to share my screen for a second, well, for the rest of the duration of the talk. Okay, so the Himalayas in particular, as we know, have long been theorized as frontier zones of both imperial and national state power. Now, the environmental and geographical diversity of this mountainous expanse has resulted in diverse local forms of customary sovereignty and territoriality, which persist today, and which historically came into conflict with strong centralizing and imperial state-building vibes in the region, which of course has historically resulted in this region being viewed primarily in terms of security and the creation or the preservation of hard borders. Now, through the 19th and 20th century, the production of so-called modern frontier spaces in Asia was shaped by really complex processes and interactions that were located within the drives of imperial expansion and uneven practices of knowledge production about these geographical spaces. So these frontiers were therefore closely linked to the very process of empire making itself, or even state making itself, as new geographical entities that did not actually map onto pre-colonial landscapes. The desire to access objects of profit and capture their networks of circulation has also historically constituted the impetus for imperial states to so-called tame these wild frontiers and thereby draw these spaces within the frame of capital. And the Himalayas, as we know, like most peripheries of empires of nation states, were and are considered problematic, risky, unmanageable area, right? Where armed conflicts, there are ethnic confrontations and contraband trade flourish. So this is framed largely as a region where state control has historically been expensive and haphazard because of its supposed political fragmentation. And the prevalent framing of these areas is really where colonial power or state power essentially goes to die. So politically and academically, this has resulted in Himalayan and Tibetan regions being framed as historically marginalized areas, which is essentially a political geography of silence and erasure. So in my work in general, I tend to question the very production of this kind of peripherality or marginalization of this region by studying how the movement of capital constantly undoes and really overcomes all kinds of questions of territorial concern for both colonial and post-colonial states, although of course I focus on colonial states. So to that end, today's talk is going to focus on a separate article I wrote a while ago on the British Empire's attempts to sell Indian tea to Tibet in order to investigate this link in some close detail between land, territory, and capital, and try to, in that way, rethink certain ideas about what we call British failures in the Himalayas and in Tibet, or what becomes Tibet. The space of the frontier has historically been witnessed in circulation of a broad spectrum of objects that have mediated the very processes of frontier making itself. In such processes, studying the movement of objects and commodities, like tea, highlights the constructed nature of different spaces, as well as their interconnections. So the potential of tea as an object to move across registers dramatically encapsulates the anxieties entangled within imperial state-making practices, as well as in the production of institutionalized peripheries of what we're calling frontier. So of the manifold terrors of the so-called unknowable foreign, the taste of Tibetan tea raised particularly unpalatable specters for the British colonial state in India. By the late 19th century, the government of India was beginning to enjoy the profits stemming from the huge investment in industrializing tea production in India, and British tea imports from India to Europe had overtaken those from China. So Britain seemed quite comfortably poised to replace China as the premier supplier of tea to Europe. However, in this congenial picture of imperial supremacy, neighboring Tibet still seemed to prefer Chinese tea, specifically the kind sourced from the Tibetan peripheries in the Sichuan province. This vast landmass just beyond the borders of the Himalayas, which was regularly romanticized in diplomatic correspondence and even scholarly analysis of Victorian explorer bureaucrats as the ultimate impenetrable, this landmass appeared to remain impervious to British attempts to push Indian tea into its markets. In 1869, British officials noted that an annual consumption of close to 10 million pounds of Chinese brick tea by Tibetans was a market share seemingly ripe for the taking. But by the 1940s, despite dedicated government commissions, fact-finding publications, and many, many trade and political treaties, the last British envoys to Lhasa, such as Hugh Richardson, lamented that the years had borne absolutely no results of the strenuous efforts to find in Tibet a market for Indian tea, of which there were formerly great hopes. Now, the reason for such British failure in Tibet, which was chiefly self-identified by late 19th and early 20th century colonial commentators, centered on really dramatic expositions of the reportedly terrible taste of Tibetan butter tea. So this tea was traditionally prepared with Chinese pu'er chow, pu'er tea, which was sold in the form of bricks, and it was mixed with butter and salt, or sampa, or barley, which is barley flour, as you can see pictured here. The colonial administrator John Crawford, on the subject of British and British Indian trade commerce with Tibet, remarked of butter tea that it was, quote, horrible trash and would produce a wash that would turn the stomach of a hog. When samples of this tea, which was consumed in Tibet, was collected in 1894 and sent to the Indian Museum in Calcutta, an underling's response to the proposal that the tea be tasted before deposited in the museum, he said, "I have no ambition to be a taster. I have tried brick tea once, and that was quite enough. It may be that the frequent use of it would accustom one to it, but it is certainly an acquired taste." The British Orientalist Eric Teichmann, while traveling through eastern Tibet in 1922, observed on his part, "This concoction in no way resembles the European idea of tea, but it is not so bad if one is cold, hungry, and thirsty, and regards it as a kind of mealy gruel. The Tibetans, at any rate, cannot do without it, perhaps because they so seldom eat vegetables. Indian tea, which does not stew well, is not suitable for making a rancid brew of this kind." Now, accustomed as they were to tea sweetened with sugar, this salty Tibetan brew really leveled many an eager European explorer, even though creamy salty tea was customary across the Himalayan landscape through Ladakh and Kashmir. Teichmann, in fact, in 1922, reiterated the argument that had, by the early sort of 20th century, taken really unshakable root in colonial explanation, that xenophobic Tibetan tastes presented an absolutely insurmountable challenge to the government of India's economic imperatives, and that the result of this was that the sale of Indian tea was a question of the palate, not of profit. Now, over the course of 5 sections today, I'd like to offer a new narrative for the transformation of Himalayan and Trans-Himalayan landscapes between 1860 and about 1940, wherein Tibet went from being an important part of British attempts to remake a global market for tea to a minor addendum in the history of so-called British failures against Chinese competition. The trajectory that I'm about to relate sets out essentially the last 5 decades of the 19th century, where sustained British interventions to create a market for Indian tea in Tibetan regions began to taper off after the first decade of the 20th century in regions that coterminously came to be called Tibet proper. So through these arguments, I'd like to illustrate really the expedient use of Tibetan land and territory by the movement and prospects of profits garnered from selling tea. So in the first section, I will lay out the scope and historical debates surrounding the conceptualization of Tibet as a spatial, geographical, and cultural unit to really set the context for understanding how the eventual impact of this terrain was written over and respatialized by the designs of capitalist profit. The second and third sections essentially describe tea cultures prevalent in those Tibetan regions. The government of India's grasp of these networks as it negotiated the landscapes in its attempt to open additional markets to sell Indian tea, and the military violence involved in the establishments of these posts, to demonstrate again how the exigencies of war propaganda and imperial frontier making shape the cultural and spatial frames of tea consumption in Tibet, India, and even China. The fourth and fifth sections following compare case studies of the trading posts that were established in and beyond the mountain chains of the Eastern Himalayas. So what I will do here in these sections is essentially offer an analysis of the connections between 6 trade marts, namely Kalimpong, Darjeeling, Gangtok, Yatong, Gyaltse, and Gartok, that were established in the Tibetan regions through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not simply as centers of imperial trade between British India and Qing China, but really as occupied territories that were meant to form key nodes on new imperial land networks throughout the Tibetan Plateau and highlands. The fourth section in particular considers the integration of Darjeeling and Sikkim into global markets for Indian tea as a result of the military interventions of the British Indian state. And the fifth section will focus on British efforts to set up trading posts in Yatong, Gyatse, and Gartok, and the fates of these marts beyond the Himalayas. The connections between these marts produced an alternate mapping of the South Asian highlands, which fundamentally transformed traditional geographies and landscapes, producing, through the really arbitrary placement of imperial borders, the very condition of Tibet as a frontier zone that was caught between the ambitions of state and capital. So, a frontier, as I said a little while ago, is not merely the physical or the topographical barrier in between political states or the site of conflict in between their politics. On the contrary, these are spaces that were characterized by complex interactions and exchanges between various cultural, social, and political communities. It is precisely this dynamic that makes frontiers fluid and ambiguous, thereby often negating legalized definitions of state boundaries. So perhaps frontier regions are actually best understood through the framework of what's called process geographies, which emphasize language, culture, or other attributes that are affixed to people or to space. Regions are therefore best viewed as initial context themes that generate variable geographies, rather than as prefixed geographies characterized by prefigured themes. So between these tussling discourses of British and Chinese imperialism, imperial border making, and imperial failure, where is the place that these empires are inscribing in their archives as what they're calling Tibet? Now, geographically speaking, Tibet includes a patchwork of a mountain-range plateau towards its center, and it slopes off towards sort of gorge country in the southeast. Historically, therefore, Tibetan peoples had lived at altitudes ranging from 1,500 to 5,000 meters above sea level in landscapes that are as varying as bone-bare tablelands, which is the idea that we have of the Tibetan plateau, to really snow-covered mountains, to fertile river plains, to densely forested valleys with subtropical summers and monsoons. Now, given this diversity, scholars have consistently argued that Tibet is actually best understood as a culture region rather than simply a territorially bounded political entity in any historical sense. At a spatial level, major areas within this culture unit would include central Tibet or Utsang, Nari in this region, Ladakh here, of course, and Kham and Amdo, which are in this area. Some of these clusters, such as Kham and Ladakh, as you can see, they vary greatly in their geographical markers, situated as they are at a distance of over 2,000 kilometers from each other. And these centers have also historically interacted differently with the power centers in both India and China. Now, historically, cultural Tibet, for the most part, coincides with this geographic Tibet, in the sense that the dominant livelihoods of nomadic pastoralism and sedentary agriculture based on mountain valley and upland habits overlap with a culture region whose social and material practices often converge around monasterial life and authorities. As literary and political culture, these are often defined by their use of the Tibetan script, sharing similar structures of social organization, and adhere to either Bon or Tibetan Buddhism, as defined by widespread monasticism and lineage structures. Beyond the Tibetan heartland, there lies a thick borderland of Tibetan and semi-Tibetan groups that still comprise part of the Tibetan cultural region. Now, these groups might adhere to Buddhism or Bon, but speak vernaculars that are fairly dissimilar to each other, and are often integrated with the practices of other local social, cultural, and religious groups of varied ethnic stock that are situated throughout the mountainous regions of the greater and the lesser Himalayas down here, as well as the Sino-Tibetan borderlands on this other side. So communities that are populating this broad Tibetan cultural landscape go essentially from down the Zanskar range in Kashmir, extending throughout the Himalayan kingdoms of Nepal, Sikkim, and Bhutan into Upper Assam and modern-day Arunachal Pradesh. And these were linked through a complex system of constantly mobile people, goods, commodities, and ideas in what some scholars have called monastic geographicity. So Tibet and what I'm calling its border worlds were not simply a cultural, ecological, and geopolitical frontier area. And indeed, neither do the archives from the pre-1800s from Tibet, Bhutan, Sikkim, Assam, Burma, all of these places, they do not conceptualize these regions or their relations in terms of the frontier at all. Rather, their historical scope over the 19th and early 20th century came to be defined by the constant clashes between a loosely defined Tibetan ecclesiastical state, whose spheres of influence were progressively limited and contained by British Indian and Chinese imperial power. So multiform polities and societies characterize these complex geographies, which were significantly reordered as a result of their encounters with both British Indian and Qing states. These geographies subsequently came to represent the periphery or the limits of imperial authority and influence. So in the process, these imperial frontiers then came to signify marginal spaces, marginal as they were, being located on the edges of empires or imperial territories. And this in turn would undergird that center-periphery model that is still used to frame the discussion of these spaces in scholarship. Now, colonial British commentators in particular often chose to distinguish between what they call Tibet proper and the border worlds as Great Tibet and Little Tibet. Charles Bell, one of the most famous British officials in Tibet in 1922, laid out the clearest deconstruction of the Tibetan cultural region. As you can see in the map that he drew here, there was political Tibet, which was bounded in this way, which was a remote, unchanging plateau over which the Dalai Lama or their regents had ruled for more or less continuously, and what he called ethnographic Tibet, which spilled into the Chinese provinces of Xikang and Qinghai, Gansu, Sichuan, and Yunnan in the east, as you can see here, and through the Himalayan frontier, including places like Ladakh, Sikkim, and Bhutan to the west. Notably, as you can see, the regions that Charles Bell and other British political commentators called Little Tibet in the colonial archive were gradually incorporated into the territorial holdings of British India throughout the entirety of the 19th century. While what they called Tibet proper, as an entity beyond the borders that were being drawn by British India, tended to collapse the diversity of the geographical features, administrative power, customs, language, and social organization that I just mentioned into the metonym of Lhasa. So Tibet proper for the British came to be represented by the center of Lhasa. Meanwhile, Qing and Republican states around the same time through the 19th and early 20th century gradually came to regard these eastern frontier Tibetans as representative of Tibetans from central Tibet, thereby extending a political claim over the entire Tibetan cultural region. And these territorial claims resulted in a complicated negotiation of the space of the Sino-Tibetan borderlands, rendering broad central Tibetan regions as the imperial Chinese periphery. So what we're calling Tibet as a physically and historically contained landmass was really discursively shaped by the acquisitive desires of capital and drawn to design by the imperial mappers of British India and Qing China. The simple conceptualization of what we're calling failure then in the Himalayas as it is hinged on a spatially bound parameter labeled Tibet or the Himalayas, really limits any deep analysis of the extractive nature of British imperial ambition in the Himalayan areas. Instead, what we'll do today is look at the ways in which the sale of Indian tea in British India and so-called Tibet contributed to the transformation of the landscape of the Tibetan cultural region and the ultimate production of its peripherality. Now, histories of tea consumption in Tibet date back to the 8th century, intertwined with the beginnings of Tantric Buddhism in the region. The earliest recorded evidence of wide-scale trade and tea consumption of Tibet dates to the 11th century, probably as a result of the trade on the Tea Horse Road during the Song dynasty. Tea really fueled elite and spiritual and ritual Buddhist practice and community formation in China, Tibet, Japan, and Korea, where it became crucially linked to the economic and cultural life of the monasteries. However, tea also had widespread non-ritual community value in these centers, often inspiring elaborate customary traditions outside monasteries, and was, of course, also coveted for its nutritional and medicinal properties. Now, while Tibet received many varieties of Chinese tea, pu'er cha was packaged as bricks and was recorded as the most commonly consumed kind since the early 1300s. It is often still packaged and sold now, of course, in specialty packaging in many of the same regions in Tibet and China. This photo is from 2019. And again, this is a specialty shop that's trying to sort of tap into that historical tourism field of what it was like to be a part of these communities and trading in the objects that they would have been trading in from about sort of the late 19th, early 20th century. Now, in a region that was as broad and geographically and ethnically complex as Tibet, pu'er cha helped to forge connections between local regional elites and monasteries, as well as with the outside world. These tea bricks were so popular that they were often used as a form of currency between, say, about the 18th to even the late 20th century. The value of tea arose from its portability for transport, as well as the fact that it could be easily prepared for large groups. By the 19th century, it had also become a vital bargaining chip in political and economic negotiations between the Tibetan and central Qing governments. Now, pu'er had the dual advantage of functioning as both a tribute gift and a commodity. So, for example, first-grade tea was presented as an annual gift by the Qing to both the Dalai Lama at Lhasa and the Panchen Lama at Shigatse. I know the resolution on these is not great, but perhaps you can see in sort of the close-up here. This is the second Qing emperor, the Shunzi emperor, and the fifth Dalai Lama. And this is a tribute mission where, as you can see, the paraphernalia for tea is a big part of the representation of the gifts that were carried to Tibet as a result of this tribute mission. It was also common practice for ambans, or Qing regents who were posted to Lhasa, to buy hundreds of pounds of tea in Dartsedo, which is modern-day Kangding in Kham, Sichuan province, modern-day Sichuan province in China. It was common practice for them to buy hundreds of pounds of tea as gifts on their way to the Tibetan capital. As tribute, tea could symbolize local communities' loyalty to the Qing. And further, because tea drinking also exhibited what was called refined taste, as per Confucian tradition, there were considerable profits made to be made by exploiting these kinds of culturally bound notions of taste. Now, as a commodity, pu'er was deeply embedded in major trade networks throughout Tibet that linked that landmass to regions that went past the dominions of both Qing China and British India. Now, as a chief arterial vein of Inner Asia, the Tea Horse Road facilitated more than simply the business of trade. Much like the Silk Road, it was also the major conduit for the spread of religions, philosophies, and discourses in material and ideological forms. Now, recent scholarship on the interconnected spaces that span northern Thailand, coastal Burma, southwestern China, and northeastern India, the Himalayan borderlands essentially through Nepal, Tibet, and down into the coast of Bay of Bengal, show that these diverse geographies comprised an extensive pre-colonial map of economic, political, and cultural networks that were marked by the circulation of goods, people, ideas, discourse, and practices. Under the twin impact of capital and colonial empire making throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, these regions were gradually absorbed into the framework of so-called frontiers and borderlands that now linked the colonial territories that were possessed by imperial states. So these rich pre-colonial geographies now provided some kind of terra nullius that was discursively framed as passively anticipating the advent of both imperial ambition and capital. The colonial archive directed a lot of attention towards creating connections between these frontier regions, as it now called them, through land routes, new market regions, and communications projects. Specifically, pre-colonial networks and processes would be unearthed and appropriated by the colonial state to articulate the claims of capital and empire in the production of such new mapping. So the networks that were mapped by the Tea-Horse Road, for example, were of particular interest to the government of India when considering territorial expansion into the Himalayas and past the Himalayas. Now, the possible sale of Indian tea to these regions offered the chance to redirect political and economic influence away from both local authorities and power centers towards the British state, and therein shrink the sphere of Qing influence as well. In the 1860s, Tibet was really central to a broadly stated British ambition to destroy and annihilate the Chinese monopoly in its quest for global tea supremacy. Now, poor Chinese brick tea from Xishuangbanna or Xishuangbanna in southern Yunnan was commonly transported from here north into Tibet and from thence into Indian territory, crossing. So essentially the itinerary that I mentioned before, Dartsedo is in the Kham region, which is about here. It would go from Yunnan into Kham, into Lhasa, into central Tibet, and then into these regions. And from there, essentially, enter British Indian territory by the mid-19th century. So the Qing era saw Xishuangbanna explode in prominence with Yunnan pu'er that was elevated from a local group to a national commodity. Tea was gathered from the 6 great tea mountains east of the Mekong River to be processed in small round or brick-shaped cakes and wrapped usually in bamboo, as you saw in the picture before, for long-distance transport. Trans-Himalayan caravans comprising Chinese, Hui Muslim, and Tibetan merchants would then collect these packaged blocks and load mules, donkeys, and horses with the tea by strapping the goods to their sides. They would wind north through Yunnan for approximately 6 months, and then these caravans would travel either into Dartsedo in Kham, which route would take them further onward to Chengdu in Sichuan, and then China proper, or go the other way to Lhasa, from where many routes led to India. Once the tea reached Lhasa, it might then be traded for or along with other goods, including borax, serge cloth, wool, musk furs, and gold, which were all commodities that were sought after by the government of India in trading with Tibet. From Lhasa, Kashmiri, Tibetan, and Newari caravans, among would travel south, passing in approximately a month's time through places like Yangtze, Pari, Yatung, and finally entering Kalimpong through either the Jelapla or the Nathula Pass in Sikkim, in this area. Now, after border skirmishes with Bhutan through the 1860s, the government of India acquired Kalimpong, which was then a minor Bhutanese port town. It was absorbed into the district of Darjeeling in 1866, and Kalimpong soon became an important local trade center for the Eastern Himalayas. Colonial officials in the late 19th century were already well aware of the circulation of trade caravans to and from Lhasa, and attempted to ascertain with great specificity the scale and scope of exchange in commodities and the magnitude of revenues involved. The archive makes clear that officials were cognizant of the popular routes, although they never referred to the Tea-Horse Road by its name. They noted with dismay, rather, that trade continued to be conducted by feudatory states such as Sikkim, Bhutan, and Kashmir, And they lamented this because it was unregulated by the British state. Until 1904, these feudatory states officially pledged allegiance and loyalty to the Dalai Lama, rather than to the government of India itself, thus setting up the Lhasa administration as a political and an economic competitor to British India. Now, in 1903-1904, the government of India attempted to alleviate some of these trading difficulties, including the sale of Indian tea, by launching a military invasion of Tibet. Many of you might already be familiar with what is popularly called the Young Husband Mission. Its official name was the Tibet Frontier Commission, which was under the twin political and military charges of Francis Young Husband, this guy, and James Leslie MacDonald, this. And the Tibet Frontier Commission was tasked, among other things, with securing the exclusive right to trademarks in central Tibet. The commission forced a trade agreement on the Lhasa port while the Dalai Lama had fled to Mongolia, and through this trade agreement, annexed the city of Gyansi in southern Tibet and occupied the Chumbi Valley. After a British trade agency, so this is essentially where the Chumbi Valley is, and after the British trade agency was installed in Gyansi, which is up here, in 1904, Kalimpong grew to even more importance as the major market for trans-Himalayan trade in the area. Commodities accumulated at Kalimpong would then be forwarded via the heartland routes throughout the rest of the British Indian Empire. Following the return of the Tibet Frontier Commission in 1904, further, the government of India began to demand letters of obedience from the official, which included the official acknowledgement of British sovereignty by those same communities that conducted trade and exchange along the border and the Himalayan regions. So the colonial state hoped to use the practices of mapping and surveying to set out the borders of a more centralized polity, thus creating the British Indian Empire as a bounded political entity. Colonial borders, however, turned very quickly into the frontiers of potential territorial, revenue, and resource expansion. The frontiers of local autonomy were gradually eroded in the restructuring of Indian administrative units to the late 19th and early 20th century. At the same time, other kinds of inner lines and protected areas were imposed to create state monopolies over natural resources, to increase tax revenues, and to enforce strategic imperatives. These so-called inner lines were really aimed at keeping peripatetic pre-colonial networks of association from regrouping to acquire land, goods, or subjects in areas that were coveted by the colonial state. Now, tea consumption had risen dramatically by the second quarter of the 18th century in many parts of northwestern Europe, especially in England. The demand for tea and coffee rose proportionally alongside the demand for sugar, and the regular consumption of these beverages came to function as markers of bourgeois respectability in Europe. Hoping to reduce the expenditure and reliance on Chinese tea to sustain such a demand in Europe, the East India Company hoped to position itself as a serious competitor to China as the world's chief importer of tea. One issue at hand was to sell opium to China to balance the trade, and the other was to begin directly growing and manufacturing tea in British-owned territory. The early colonial state in India had actually begun mass-producing tea in India by the 1830s after annexing land from the Kingdom of Sikkim. The earliest tea gardens were located in east and northeastern India, in Darjeeling and Assam, which were then both part of the Bengal Presidency. While they grew a small amount of green and white tea, these gardens chiefly grew black tea. Although the indigenous Indian varieties of tea were initially well received in England, commercial success did not arrive until well into the 1850s. By 1870, colonial officials that were tracking the tea trade in Tibet estimated that the region consumes annually 6 million pounds of Chinese brick tea produced in Sichuan province, making it, of course, a proximal and desirable market for the government of India to consider for the sale of Indian tea. In 1883, the Bengal Secretariat published a memorandum called A Tea Trade with Tibet, and this pamphlet laid out the known parameters of the scale of the Sino-Indian trade and recommended that tea bricks be prepared in Indian gardens for export to Tibet specifically. So chiefly, this meant using the whole part of the tea plant other than simply the tips, which is what we Indians know constitutes good tea. Tea marked for export to Britain and Europe, like this, utilize only the small, finer upper leaves of the tea plant. But brick tea, however, also made use of other parts of the plant, which, depending on the quality of the tea, could include not just the large lower leaves, it could also include twigs and branches in its composition. Now, after securing the renewal in 1893 of the Anglo-Chinese Convention, the Deputy Commissioner of Darjeeling, Alfred Wallace Paul, traveled to Yatong, which is modern-day Yadong County, also known as Dromo County in China, which was one of the trademarks negotiated as part of the convention to gauge the possible success of trading British tea grown in India to Tibet. He compiled a report identifying the 10 main kinds of tea consumed in Tibet. He classified them by name, by quality, and the market rates at which they were sold in the Artsedo, sometimes including comparative price information from the Lhasa or Chumbi Valley market. Paul himself appeared quite dubious about the prospects of success selling Indian tea to Tibet. He noted that Tibetans do not like new tea, and new tea disagrees with them, so any attempt to press new tea on them at the outset must fail. Paul's remarks were based on his observation of the method of tea preparation in Tibet. Unlike Indian tea, which was and is processed in a way that retains the freshness of the raw tea, pu'er, which is prepared and preferred in Tibet, was aged and processed by fermenting the raw tea. When it was aged in this fashion, the pu'er gained a dark, rich color and a bold, mellow flavor, whereas Indian tea tasted comparatively milder and sweeter. Tibetan tea was generally drunk extremely well boiled. Tibetan tea was also drunk, generally mixed with butter and salt or mixed with sampa, both concoctions that would be heavy on the stomach and whose earthiness and substance could almost function as a meal in itself. Now, Paul concluded that in order to build a taste market for Indian tea or to create a demand for it as a commodity, Indian planters might have to sell large samples to British officers at Yatong, hoping for sort of free distribution among Tibetan traders over the long course of 5 years. However, since Indian tea could not provide the body for tea beverages as they were customarily consumed in Tibet, in order to make any proportion of the trade significant at all, Indian planters would need to manufacture varieties of Tibetan brick tea instead. So he collected and sent samples of these tea to Calcutta, meant for the research and benefit of Indian planters who might consider growing some of these varieties in order to appeal to the Tibetan market. However, Paul further postulated that given contemporary import duties, it would be impossible for Indian planters to manufacture brick tea costing under 2 annas a pound, at which rate it simply could not compete with Chinese brick tea. His detailed memorandum ended with the comment, Indian brick tea will have little chance of a market, so I have grave doubts whether any real attempt in this direction will be made. Instead, in Paul's estimation, which was supported by many other colonial officials, the only way to keep costs down for Indian-made Tibetan brick tea was to create new, long-distance overland routes from Darjeeling and Sikkim into central Tibet, which could provide considerable and cheap means of conveyance for merchants and traders, effectively undercutting the connected transport network that was enjoyed by traders entering Tibet and India through Chinese territory. Now, the British state's intervention in the Indian foothills of the Himalayas, as I mentioned before, this was intended to redirect revenue and labor services away from pre-colonial authorities and networks that were centered around local monastic leaders towards British colonial, military, and economic agencies. Such a redirection could certainly be achieved by capturing the routes and roads that were already in use, but could also aspire to supplant that physical geography by building a whole new network of overland routes and roads. Both would result in ultimately transforming the landscape of Tibet and the Himalayan borderlands. So Alfred Wallace Paul was not the only official to whom road building appealed as an alternate mapping of the geographies whose political and economic significance was coveted by the colonial state. The incorporation of Sikkim within British Indian territory involved concerted attempts to bring this kind of alternative mapping of pre-colonial Himalayan networks to life. So in 1884, the government of India sent a preliminary military expedition into Sikkim, and Tibetan defense responded in the form of sort of 300 armed soldiers that crossed the Jelep Pass in 1886 and ended up occupying several border forts linked to in northern Sikkim. John Claude White, a colonial official who would later be a part of the Tibetan Frontier Commission, he was dispatched as the head of a punitive force in 1888 to expel the Tibetans. And after forcefully installing himself as the British political officer in Gangtok, he proceeded to imprison the Maharaja of Sikkim, Thutod Namgyal, in his fort for weeks without food or water as so-called precautionary measures, while drawing new borders for British India. Now, these negotiations ultimately resulted in the Calcutta Convention of 1890, which fixed the boundary between Tibetan and British Indian territory in Sikkim, and notably, this was achieved without the consultation of either Sikkimese or Tibetan representatives. Now, these British designs on Sikkim were viewed by Qing-era commentators as an invasion of Tibet proper, and really the Qing-era commentators made very little distinction between ethnic and cultural Tibetans in Sikkim or Bhutan and Tibet itself. So these incidents of 1886 to 1888 were reported by Selenge, who was then Amban in Lhasa, to the Guangxu Emperor as a British invasion of Tibet itself. Meanwhile, White became convinced by this incident that not only were better roads needed across the Jelep and Naku passes in order to facilitate the quick progress of troops and goods, but most importantly, these needed to be new roads that were not already embedded within the traditional route networks local to the region. So he desired, at the very least, to build a cart road 29 miles long that would connect Gangtok to the Chumbi Valley over the Naku Pass. He petitioned both the government of Bengal and the government of India for years in the attempt to be granted the permission, funds, and coolie labor required for a project of this magnitude. And while this proposal was recommended by a number of other colonial officials, overseeing bureaucrats in both the finance and military departments remained unmoved. There is very little to suggest that they didn't see the value in the construction of new roads. Rather, it was White's personality himself, apparently, which was the sticking point. Since he was seen as somebody who possessed judgment that tended to incite international scandals on account of his temper. And so his superiors were at best willing to consider the allocation of funds for a mule path, but not a cart road. Now, mule paths or unpaved or what are called kacha roads were considerably less expensive to build, but subject to erasure by inclement weather, and therefore often trap caravans and moving parties in their resultant sort of disintegration. White was frustrated enough that he began to construct this road without permission in 1903 in the advance of the Tibet Frontier Commission, but the military department came down hard, halting all work on the road, of which only 5 miles had been constructed, redirecting resources and placing the Tibet Frontier Commission on strict budgetary restrictions. Now, even though the project of building this kind of alternate circulatory system of roads in the Trans-Himalayan borderlands garnered lukewarm enthusiasm, the landscape of trading tea was already successfully transformed in both Sikkim and Darjeeling. Why? Because prior to the 1830s, tea was coveted as a luxury item among Sikkimese peoples, given its popularity among high lamas and the lay elite, as well as its perceived associations with the mighty cosmopolitan emperors of Qing China. The commercial success of tea gardens after 1850 resulted in increased access across social classes, as well as economic profits for the local communities through increased collaboration with the British colonial state. And this did not go unnoticed by Qing observers. The Amman at Lhasa reported to the Guangxu Emperor with dismay that local residents were partnering with the British state in the production and the sale of Indian tea. Such economic alliances, however, did not appear to quickly translate into the transformation of the cultural tastes we've been talking about. Even after Darjeeling tea began to reap high profits, Chinese tea continued to be valued, possibly because it became, by contrast, more expensive than the locally made Indian tea, lending to it, therefore, the aspirational color of bourgeois respectability. While the perceived loss of cultural capital as well as annual revenue for brick tea was framed by Qing commentators in terms of an attack on Chinese sovereignty in the region, The anecdotal evidence that was collected by monasterial officials and informants of continuing preferences for pu'er was also framed by the same Chinese observers as steadfast loyalty of Tibetan subjects towards sort of the idea of the Chinese nation, despite serious encroachment by the British. Now, passing through Calcutta in 1879, Huang Maosai, who was an emissary of the then governor of Sichuan province, Din Bangchang, observed that the British copied the packaging of Sichuan tea in Darjeeling in order to transport it from Darjeeling to Tibet. And I don't have a picture of Huang Maosai, unfortunately, but this is an image of the route map that he used to get from China to Calcutta. Now, what he observed that the products were packaged as smaller cakes or pao, as he described them. And it's possible that this kind of packaging possibly saves suppliers of Indian tea money on transport fees, as well as in designing it to make it look familiar and appealing to Tibetan consumers. The use of creative packaging to create demand for or sell the less desired product of Indian tea continued well into the 1930s, when famous Tibetan trading families like the Pandit sons sold Indian tea repackaged as Chinese tea. Consumers of this fake tea may or may not have been aware that they were actually buying the Darjeeling variant. However, the failure to transform local taste in favor of local product indicated the continued cultural capital of Chinese brick tea. However, it is important not to overstate these as well. Because as we know, the condition of colonial modernity was profoundly transformative to most aspects of public culture and everyday life in India, with the British state's interest and ability to penetrate cultural, communitarian, and domestic spheres greatly amplified in comparison to the pre-colonial era. The preference for Chinese tea for the preparation of a specific kind of butter tea against the adoption of the Indian leaf could also be read as some kind of granular resistance to imperial subjecthood under British government. That is to say, while Tibetan taste did not impede the successful redirection of goods and services towards the colonial state in Sikkim and Darjeeling, and while the market for Indian tea was remade in these very locations, the continued proclivity towards brick tea by locals demonstrates that the extension of British political and economic hegemony is far from an all-subsuming narrative of triumphant capital. So while tea and taste do not and did not in the late 19th century conform to the political boundaries of British India, and while granular resistances may have impeded the transformation of cultural Tibetan landscapes, it is again, like I said, important not to overstate their importance. Because while objects, and indeed objects such as tea, do possess qualities that affect human designs and endeavors, the problem with much object history is that it's merely an alternative sort of empty materialism. So to imagine that the Tibetan preference for brick tea resulted from an agency of specific taste is really to gravely obscure the context, the economic context within which this kind of tea was produced and traded. Because while pu'er remained the preferred brew for local communities in Sikkim, and Indian tea seemingly could not penetrate this domestic market, the very same communities came to see the British state as a source of wealth and collaborated in the growth of the tea industry and laid claim to a share of the profits therein. With trade to England and Europe booming, few planters showed any interest in official recommendations to reconfigure their gardens to produce Chinese or even Indian variants of brick tea for sale to cultural Tibetan markets and to Tibet proper. So the production of Indian Tibet tea bricks at plantations was largely experimental and quickly died out. So the issue of taste was indeed so central to the sale of tea to Tibet, then the reluctance of Indian and Tibetan planters to share any corner of the possible profits is really surprising, unless they understood those profits to be completely negligible on balance. Even trading families like the Pandit sons found it much more profitable to repackage and sell Indian tea rather than include the financing of Indian-produced brick tea among their business ventures. The transmutation of Sikkimese land into British Indian territory in particular dramatized the degree to which the landscape of Tibetan cultural regions had been irrecoverably transformed. The placing of modern borders on local and customary networks and geographies produced Tibet as a peripheral frontier region. So therefore, even though the colonial state achieved political and economic supremacy in Sikkim, a Tibetan border world, where it successfully established and reshaped local markets in favor of Indian tea, the new borders that had been placed between British India and Tibet would still support a narrative of thwarted ambition. The government of India's so-called failure to capture markets in central Tibet could now be ascribed to these rehearsed pretexts of Chinese and Tibetan hostility, to a lack of roads and infrastructure, and more importantly, to the savage and supposedly uncouth tastes of the Tibetans. The government of India had successfully established 3 British trademarks in central Tibet, at Yadong, past the Jelapla at the southern mouth of the Chumbi Valley, further north at Yangtze, and triangulated at Gartok in western Tibet. None of these marks, encompassing between them the whole of the Chumbi Valley, ever proved a successful market for the sale of Indian tea. All of them were established through military intervention. The opening of a place like Yatong was tentatively broached in 1890 in Calcutta, and the mark was finally secured in 1893, and then it was included in the 1904 Lhasa Convention, where it joined Yangtze and Gartok as the Young Husband Mission's legacy in Tibet. Now, viewed as these 3 sort of solitary trading posts with short-lived histories in Tibet, these really strengthen a narrative of thwarted British ambition in the region. But viewed in its extension of the trading posts of Kalimpong, Darjeeling, and Gangtok in now British India, they pointed explicitly to the British state's knowledge and invocation of older geographies and networks, as well as to the symmetry of mechanisms used to annex new trading and political rights. As students of South Asian history will know, the East India Company's early campaigns of land acquisition in the subcontinent often involved casting itself not so much as the competitor to, but the local successor of the declining Mughal state. And it did the same kind of mimicry in Tibet. This mimicry was the British state's attempt to establish a cultural analogy in order to render the unknowable foreign, as it had done with Persian practices elsewhere in India. The foundation of colonial authority often rested on the successful negotiation of such zones of merging and selective collaborations through customary law with colonized populations. These kinds of negotiations were frequently more difficult to perform beyond the Himalayas without the support of additional state machinery. So military invasions, or at least the threats of military invasions, helped to expedite the urgency of the British cause. Although none of these British trademarks were able to provide a sufficient market for the sale of Indian tea, they were hardly maintained simply for prestige, as Alex McKay and other scholars have written. Following the occupation of the Chumbi Valley in 1904, both Yangtze and Yatong saw local markets redirected to directly in front of the British camp. And while most members of the Tibet Frontier Commission returned to India following the signing of the treaty in 1904, Frederick Marshman Bailey remained in Yangtze as the first political officer at the newly minted British agency in Yangtze. And by the 1920s, these centers, especially the one you see pictured here in Yangtze, was so well established that mountaineering expeditions into the Himalayas saw fresh vegetables, meat, and dairy sourced to summit base camps from Yangtze and Chumbi, even though it would take often more than a fortnight to reach those camps from the Chumbi Valley. Now, the performative pageantry of empire is generally imagined as happening at the center or in capitals of imperial territory. So Delhi is therefore more easily visualized as draped in imperial pomp and ceremony than lonely mud-built Yangtze. And yet, these trademarks were the precise sites at which frontier bureaucrats like Frederick Bailey and John Claude White created the state itself. Thinly disguised military interventions that gave way to border-defining conventions and trade agreements extended claims to suzerainty, and these were in fact the ceremonials of the imperial state. Such ritualized legitimacy building on part of both the British India and Qing Chinese imperial powers have now formed the basis for the deeply contested comprehensions of sovereignty, suzerainty, and even independence in Tibet. So, What do we conclude? By the 1920s, British postmortems of the failure to sell Indian tea to Tibet had come to center exclusively on cultural denunciations of so-called stubborn and xenophobic Tibetan palates, which they say continue to prefer their so-called revolting salty brew of poor China. The cultural stroke of such arguments is, of course, a familiar vein of imperial propaganda through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where similarly British planters attributed the crisis of Chinese tea to the obstinate barbarism of that race, or where they naturalized the ascendancy of Indian tea by representing some kind of innate connection between the plant and a sun. Nevertheless, the idea that Tibetan tastes were singularly responsible for derailing the scope of British commodity trade past the Himalayas is an assertion that continues to hold surprising traction in even contemporary analysis of this period and this region. However, as I have argued, the question of Tibetan taste was simply a convenient foil to explain away the failure to successfully push Tibetan Indian tea into Tibetan and further flung markets beyond the Himalayas. The cultural preference for Chinese tea remained dominant in the Tibetan markets of Sikkim, Darjeeling, and Kalimpong, the very centers that were forcibly integrated into a global market for Indian tea and considered crucial to British success. On the other side of the Himalayas, while the markets of Yatung, Gyansa, and Gartha grew to become centers that crucially supported the mountaineering and agency industry in the Himalayas, they were never successful outposts for the sale of Indian tea. And these were also the centers that by the 1920s were being relegated to the spatial unit that was now being called Tibet proper, or political Tibet, or Greater Tibet, by contemporary and future British commentators. So what this really shows is that British annexation of Tibetan land was merely an intermediate link between the money that was gained from the sale of Indian tea to the global market and more capital. So Tibet was not a place that empire could not reach. Rather, it was shaped as a bounded entity by what was cut away from it and subsumed into both British India and Qing China. So therefore, in order to study Tibet as a re-territorialized sort of spatialist assemblage is the only way to move past these kinds of adjectival, rhetorical truth claims or taste claims, if you will, of the imperial empire, of the imperial archive. So while the rubric of failure helps to understand imperial practices to some degree, ultimately it further discursively grounds the peripherality of Tibet to the reconfigured geographies of British and Chinese empires. The invention of the Himalayas as a mountainous barrier between India and Tibet through the 19th and early 20th centuries served really the purpose of rupturing pre-colonial networks and strengthen a political, spatial, and administrative logic of imperial borders. But the fact that its peripherality of these Trans-Himalayan regions was and is an expedient category is made amply clear by imperial and nationalistic propaganda that underscores the periphery as crucial to the territorial integrity of political formation. And you all know what I'm talking about. This is the legacy that continues to cloud the understanding of border issues between contemporary India and China. This is the sort of thing that legitimized both the annexation of Sikkim by independent India in 1975, as well as the invasion of Tibet by communist China in 1949. And with that, I will finally stop testing your patience.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was a very rich talk and a lot to digest in terms of different sorts of histories of objects, histories of empire. The floor is open for questions. So whoever wants to ask, we have a small group. I think you could just raise your hand and ask the question.
I'm going to jump right in because this is such an exciting talk. Thank you for your most riveting presentation, Sayantani. Also really richly textured in terms of the histories that you pulled together in the talk. I have, I think, a huge number of questions, but I'll try to confine myself to one, a puzzling description of Tibetan taste as barbarian in the documents that you mentioned. But surely for, more than a century before that, British was selling Chinese tea in Europe. And why would they then see the use of Chinese tea by Tibetans as barbaric or condemn that as a barbarian taste? Is it only because Indian tea was then becoming the staple of British profit and British trade in Europe? Did Indian tea completely supplant the trade in Chinese tea? Because surely with the opium trade, British was still able to get large amounts of Chinese tea into the European market. So that was a bit of a puzzle. Um, so maybe it wasn't brick tea that they were selling in Europe, and brick tea was being singled out as a barbarian taste. I have no idea, but I'd love for you to address that question. And a slightly minor one about, I think I really liked how you talked about tea as tribute and commodity, and I would like to add the word currency to that, because as you showed, tea was used to trade for other things, even in Tibet. And I was sort of wondering then, was it only tea that was being brought from Yunnan up north and into Tibet and then via Kalimpong and Nathula into India? Or were there other commodities, other foodstuffs, other spices also traveling? And if so, how would that impact the way we think about the centrality of tea?
Would you like me to answer the questions one by one, or should we do a round and
We can take one or two more questions.
Right. May I?
Yeah, sure, Rahul.
Wow, this was such an amazing presentation, Anthony. I really enjoyed the so many threads that you're sort of bringing them together. I'm wondering about two things, or maybe in some sense only one thing, which is, was this, how does one sort of get into the internal narrative of Tibet about its own sort of culturalism? Um, this is in some sense inspired by, say, Matthew Capstein's work on the geographical, knowledge in 18th century Tibet. And so in some sense, what I find in that kind of a scholarship is a certain, use of Indian terms based on, say, the Madhyamika Buddhism, and ideas like Jambudvipa as a key category and so on and so forth. So I'm sort of wondering, how did Tibetan own sort of discourse about itself, its cultural taste, its historicity, its relationship to, these two broad categories like India and China, so on and so forth. So how do we sort of make sense of that internal version of its own culture? That's one. And the other thing is that much like what Tejaswini was wondering about tea as a currency, I was also wondering as tea as a form of community, as in tea in some senses has also been very significant in meditation practices, in monasteries, Buddhist monasteries across these spaces. So I wonder if that kind of meaning did play any significant part in, say, preference over Chinese tea. There are, of course, these multiple factors of administration, capital, trade, and all those are very much there in this context. But I'm also wondering if this is also then another aspect of the internal. What is the internal story of Tibet's own relationship to tea, relationship to India, relationship to what is this sort of knowledge production that they are part of? Right. I hope it makes sense. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, maybe so I can ask the last of the three questions and you can take them together and then we can go on to the next round. So I was a little bit, again, very interesting and so many diverse threads. So the question was to unpack the notion of what was Indian tea itself, because the British are producing, because this is again for export tea which is being grown in India is what is the distinction between the tea which is being grown in Darjeeling as opposed to the tea which is being grown in Assam, for example? And that question was also recurring in my mind on where Assam fits into this imaginary, because in the geopolitics or economics of this trading, Assam is a big thing, Assam tea, and Assam species of tea is different from the Darjeeling species of tea. But there is also intermixture going on there. So that question of, because in and I'm an ethnographer, so I can't speak so much to history, but there is this sense like the workers who produce the Darjeeling tea do not have the fancy British taste of having the Darjeeling tea without tea, etc. Right? They have the Desi Indian tea. So even their taste is varied. And these are workers who came from Nepal that historic period. So then, because that idea of what is good tea seems very imperial, so how does it become Indian or any sort of Indianness? That was, and then within that, where does Assam and the distinction between Assam and Darjeeling tea fit into?
So I'll start with the last question first, because I am immediately able to recall the source documents that sort of, I used for this paper. So tea had been grown for medicinal purposes at a very, very small scale in sort of pre-colonial Assam anyway. Now, when the British discovered this tea plant in Assam, originally they do experiment with the idea of producing this at a mass scale. But that idea is abandoned very quickly because they find it does not grow well in the way or as quickly as they wanted to. So what they end up doing in the earliest tea plantations is growing Chinese tea plants. But what they're calling Indian tea essentially has to do not with the plants, but with the processing of the tea. So Indian tea, like I mentioned, is essentially picking the tips of the tea. The really delicate parts of the tea are what is then processed as fine sort of Assam or Darjeeling tea. Whereas Chinese tea, as I mentioned, is processed often by fermenting the raw tea and doesn't only use just the tips of the tea plant, but often the whole lower parts of the plant itself, but also sometimes the twigs and branches, depending on the quality. So the difference between Chinese tea and Indian tea is really more a question of processing rather than the plant that is being used. And so Chinese tea, as a result of that, is called old tea because it's fermented. Whereas Indian tea is called new tea because it is more raw. And Indian tea, this is what frames then the sort of economic, cultural discussion of what constitutes Indian tea as it is sold by the British. And really, these are the only differences. Because at the end of the day, and this was also a shock as someone that loves drinking tea, when I first discovered that all kinds of tea essentially are Chinese tea. It's just a question of how it's being processed. So yeah, so that would be sort of my reply to your question. Rahul, your question is something, that's personally, it's very complicated to me because Tibetan narratives and Tibetan discourses of the self, as it were, is something that I've been working with in my dissertation as well a lot. And again, the question keeps coming back: who are producing these kinds of discourses, right? It's mostly monastical or ecclesiastical authorities who, for example, also actually have a very interestingly colonial view of places like the Himalayas. The work that you mentioned by people like Matthew Capstein and others, Tony Hoover, etc., have also written about that. They see the space of the mountains as, mystical, holy, but also deeply savage, as places that birthed Indian Buddhism, but have lost that purity, and that purity needs to be reestablished by, guess what? Tibetan colonization. So it's very interesting and sometimes easy to lose view of this particular kind of discourse because you have two other imperial behemoths in the form of British India and Qing China that are tussling over the same regions that are forming a very interesting part of what I would in fact call a Tibetan imperial view as well. But so in terms of sort of Tibetan understandings of where cultural political Tibet lie, when it comes to the 18th, 19th, 20th century, there is a lot of interaction and overlap, of course, with Chinese and British Indian knowledge systems in understanding what is the Tibetan heartland. And these are very diverse. One of the problems with someone like Matthew Capstein's work is that he really only focuses on central Tibetan voices. Whereas if you look at voices from monastical sort of authorities in Kham, in Amdo, in Nari, they have very different understandings of what constitutes a Tibetan heartland. The Dalai Lama is really not even at the center of their imagination in any case. So the short answer is that, there is no one internal narrative of Tibet. It is just a sort of complex, geographically and discursively, but these are sort of being formed within the context of certain ideas of growing nationalism, and of course through other kinds of imperial pressures. And so the diversity of that voice is again often lost in the sort of lead up to the idea that Tibet only has specific 3 regions and has been colonized in this particular way, and that the fount of all Tibetan authority is the Dalai Lama. So there's a lot of sort of, complexity that is lost within that kind of nationalist narrative as well. But I would say that that kind of rich history is something that, or rather, I would say that, sort of, I haven't paid or haven't found that many references to sort of Tibetan discussions of butter tea as a bargaining chip against the British. The sources that I've looked at have mostly sort of understood it in terms of relations with the Qing, where, in sort of the parts that are absorbed as the parts of Tibet that are absorbed as parts of British India, places like Sikkim, Darjeeling, etc. While that cultural capital remains, where because tea is a powerful form of community, the preference for Chinese tea remains, but the economic profits that are to be reaped with collaborating with the British, and investing in things like sort of, Indian tea plantations are also sort of reaped. So that broadly gives you an idea that, again, the idea of colonial modernity is not some sort of teleological, all-subsuming narrative. There is a certain kind of granular resistance there, but again, it's important to not overstate it, because at the end of the day, these communities, while reserving their preference for consuming Chinese tea, prefer the profits that come with Indian tea, even if they aren't drinking, which means that the market has been remade in these culturally Tibetan regions. So yeah, that would be broadly. I hope that answers the questions that you. Oh, and Tejaswini, yeah. So, the questions that you asked, on the one hand, to me, that question also is like, what do we do with xenophobic discourse? How do we contextualize it, right? A lot of this xenophobic discourse essentially simply, you can say it boils down to a really simple sort of understanding of how these commentators want to understand British supremacy. And when it is expedient for them to be exporting Chinese tea is fine. But once that market for Indian tea has been made, they want to sort of, do everything they can to reduce the importance of Chinese tea. And so discursively, of course, this included not just, saying whatever they did about Chinese tea that's being sold in Tibet, but also saying things like, the reason the tea industry in China is failing is because the Chinese are this horrible xenophobic race, and they don't understand how to cultivate their own plants. That's why we are sort of winning on the global stage. Or saying things like, even though the tea plant may have been prevalent or, dominant in the forms that tea are sold on the sort of the Chinese, in the Chinese areas, actually the tea plant is sort of innately connected to Assam, and thereby innately connected to the British. And, again, discursively creating that kind of context for saying that if the Chinese are sort of, if Chinese tea is being treated anywhere, then it is to be talked about in this particularly kind of racist culturalist way. And yes, so from not so much from, there are not so many spices that are coming in from Yunnan necessarily, but when tea is brought from Yunnan to places like Kham in that Sedo or to Lhasa, large numbers of traders and caravans, which include, for example, sort of Kashmiri, Khoi Muslim, Tibetan merchants. They also trade in things like gold, serge cloth, musk, but not spices in particular, to the best of my knowledge. But there definitely are other commodities that they are trading in. Tea as a commodity, for me, encapsulates sort of, all of the anxieties that we've been talking about for the length of the distance that it is being sort of traded. And of course, to do with the discourse of how the British are trying to break, this global Chinese monopoly. And to some degree, they are able to. Not to some degree, in fact, if you read, Andy Liu and others, they do supplant the Chinese as sort of the premier importers of tea in the world.
Thank you, Shantanu. So, anybody else would you like to ask any questions? I do have a few follow-up questions. So I was wondering whether your archival research also, because we are talking a little bit about capitalism, there was an encounter with the planters themselves, and especially because these are a lot of white planters who are like managers of the land and again see themselves as better users of the land than any native population. So, if their sort of discourse, if their sort of ideas are also being put in conversation with what the imperial officers are thinking.
So the pamphlet that I mentioned before, the Trade of Tea to Tibet, is a sort of pamphlet that's put together by these colonial officials in conversations with white planters. And trying to understand what is, a cost-benefit analysis for them versus the amount of land that they own, what they can grow there, etc. But in my own research, I did not come across so many narratives by white planters, and full disclosure, I didn't look for them. The kernel of this article was that I came across the pamphlet that I mentioned and a number of other documents in the course of the archival research for my dissertation. Found these documents really interesting, but couldn't find a way to put them into my dissertation. And so on the advice of people like, Rahul and my advisor Manan, decided that to separate them out, write a separate article on. So the scope of the archival research for this article went from those archival documents to certain other sort of, maybe Chinese Tibetan documents, but I didn't sort of pursue the path of looking at narratives by white planters.
Thank you. Yeah, the reason of why I was asking is because then who profits from the sale of Indian tea in terms of what kinds of local populations get to partake in that profit? This is like because the Sikkimese when Darjeeling was annexed in 35, the idea, at least within Sikkimese suzerainty, the idea is that if I give you a land and if you do something with it, then you should pay me taxes not on the basis of what was there in the land when I leased it to you, but what you do with the land subsequently. So there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the terms of the treaty under which the entire tea estate of Darjeeling comes to be given from the Sikkimese to the British. So then who gets to have a share in that? Because clearly the British never then gave the share in the profit to the Sikkimese kings as they would have liked, and that was one of the main contentions between their relations going
Absolutely. You're right that perhaps my article didn't foreground enough that the ultimate benefiters at the end of the day are not local communities, but obviously the colonial powers. My point was to say that among local communities, alliances had shifted, an understanding of sort of political and economic expediency had remade a particular kind of local market. But yeah, of course, these communities were never considered equal stakeholders in the profits of this trade. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we have a few more minutes if anybody has any other questions. Okay, then, Tejaswini, did you want to say?
No, I just want to say there are compliments in the chat box that Shantini
Yeah, yes, yes.
That's
Uh,
very kind. And thank you to everyone for really staying till the end because it was a very long presentation.
So this was very interesting. I had, okay, one, it's not even a question and I don't even know if it's a comment. When Tejaswini said, what are the other commodities which are getting traded? Well, that question of taste, Tibetan tea goes with salt. It's salt, again, the salt routes, the salt trade in the hills is a very
Salt and
prominent,
borax, yes. Yeah. Mhm.
sort of, it has a rich cultural, economic history, etc. And sugar comes over here quite late, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So that also the association of quote unquote Indian tea with sugar and Tibetan tea with salt, which then also maps on to what is getting traded in these regions historically, is also something interesting to
Yeah,
think
it
about.
is, right? Because the sale of sugar in places like Europe goes up in tandem with the sale of things like commodities like tea and coffee. But sugar really sort of penetrates into the Indian markets through the European sort of links of colonial capital.
And doesn't go to the hills till very late compared to the plains.
Yeah.
Great.
Unfortunately, it's just little bit away from Gujarat. Otherwise, you can also people could have been trained to have the Tibetan tea not with salt but with dokla.
Okay, on that note, I think, Rahul, before we completely degenerate into PJs, let us end the talk officially over here. Shantani, thank you so much. Thank you so much for
Thank you
this
so much for
very
having me.
enlightening talk. And we had a great audience, even though we didn't get many questions, we got many compliments. So you kept the audience engaged. And we'll, for anybody who's listening, our next talk will be August 6th. We have Radhika Govindarajan rescheduled. So we'll see you at least for this series after a short break.
Thank you for having me. Hope to see you at some more of these seminars.
Great.
Send me the link for your other.
Sure, sure. So as I said, Radhika's is next. So
Yeah. Thanks, Anthony. Again, just very good to see you.
You too. And I'm taking your number from the chat box and
Yeah, so we'll talk.